So, a reclip of the Berlin Wall is a divider between East and West Germany and was taken down in 1990. Was the last of the wall, but the wall is still up in some parts of Berlin, and it is changed into a graffiti wall instead to bring happiness on a dark time in Germany. Another dark time in Germany. So the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is also known as the European Recovery Program. This established roughly 13 billion to finance the program. This established the economic recovery of Europe between 1948 and 1951. And the plan was to restore confidence of the European people in the economic future of their own countries and of Europe as a whole. And this plan for the U.S. was rebuilding the allied countries of Europe after World War II, also to stop the spread of communism and to stop communism altogether. So this George Marshall announced a commencement speech at Harvard University on June 5th, 1947. Americans saw this as a generous subvention to Europe. The Soviet Union viewed the Marshall Plan as an attempt to interfere in the internal affairs of other states and refused to participate in any action the Marshall Plan had. And the Marshall Plan was named after the Secretary of State George Marshall. So Soviets prevented Poland and Czechoslovakia from taking part. The Marshall Plan allowed the U.S. to remake the European economy in the image of their American economy. So from 1957 to 1947, the U.S. was assisting European economic recovery with direct financial aid. 16 nations, also Germany, became part of the program and shaped the assistance they required. State by state, with assistance provided through the ECA, which is the European Economic Recovery of the U.S., Marshall Plan nations were assisted greatly in their economic recovery. From 1948 through 1952, European economies grew at an unprecedented rate. So the Marshall Plan lasted about 4 years, and it ended completely in April 1948. Well, technically, it started its peak at 1948 and ended in 1952. But they tried to get the Marshall Plan to become bigger and better from 1945 to 1947, but it didn't hit its peak and grow until 1948. So the Soviet Union did not participate in the Marshall Plan at all. So was 16 nations, which was not Soviet Union. The Red Scare. The Red Scare was an anti-radical group that wanted to spread communism. The Red Scare was from 1917 to 1920, and then it followed the Bolshevik Russian Revolution of 1917. So World War I was finally over. The Eastern Front didn't go well for Russia. The new government, on November 1917, Lenin led a successful revolution of the Bolshevik workers. The U.S. sent troops to Russia, hoping the White Russians could come out on top. So the Red Scare was from 1917 to 1920, and followed the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And the Bolshevik workers was where the revolution started, and the U.S. sent troops to Russia, hoping that they could defeat the White Russians and come out on top against it and against the communist Reds. But the Bolsheviks murdered the entire royal family and took the throne and secured control of the whole nation. So the term Red Scare is used to describe periods of extreme anti-communism. Red is for the color of the Soviet Union flag. And scare is everyone that was too scared to stand up against communism. And it was the people that were scared of the Soviets coming through. So there was two Red Scare periods. First occurred after World War I and the Russian Revolution. And the second was during Cold War after World War II. And the second scare occurred during the start of the Cold War with the Soviet Union after the end of World War II. And this lasted roughly 10 years, from 1947 to 1957. And with the spread of communism in the Eastern Europe, in China and Korea, the US government was involved in the Red Scare. McCarthy accused people of communism, which means they were working for Soviet Union. And he got his intel from gossip around. But he didn't tell higher authorities that it was just gossip. He told them he had hard evidence that they were working for the Soviet Union and that they were communists. So many people lost their jobs, lost their income, their families, lost their whole life pretty much from gossip, from a story that McCarthy wanted to come out on top and be strong-headed with communism, but instead it backfired on him. He was actually wiretapped by the US because so many people were losing everything because of the things that McCarthy was saying. And the wiretapping found out that he actually was more lying and fabricating the truth. So most of the people that lost everything were victims. And this brought McCarthy to the end. This was his end of everything. And there was a big scandal in Hollywood, how movies were working around the Soviet Union and how they were making them look good and better than the US. So this was a big thing that happened in the US. So many people in Hollywood were actually looked in as communists because of the way they were depicting the Soviet Union. So the picture on the right is the red iceberg. It shows you that the US is in a boat, is on top of the world, and the communism is in Poland, Hungary, North Korea, Czechoslovakia, China, East Germany, Russia. So it shows you some countries that are depicted that communism has already spread in and has already hit. So the Red Scare was exactly just communism being spreaded. And it was the Soviet troops coming through their country. And this is what created the Red Scare. So for the Korean War, the Korean War was between North and South Korea. So it was a conflict between the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is now known as North Korea, and the Republic of Korea, which is now known as South Korea, where at least 2.5 million people lost their lives. The United Nations was the United Nations with the US joined the war on the side of South Korea, which means the United States and the United Nations fought for the South. So China fought for the North while the United Nations force fought for the South. This was fought on the Korean land, the Sea of Japan, in the Korean Strait. It was fought in the air. So it was many countries fighting for territory of Korea. So China came to the aid of North Korea, hoping that maybe eventually they could seize the North. So after more than 1,000,000 combat casualties had been suffered on both sides, the fighting ended in July 1953, with Korea still divided into two hostile states. Negotiations in 1954 produced no further agreement, and the front line hasn't been accepted ever since as the de facto boundary between North and South Korea. So they never really did an agreement on what would go down. And there was many spies in between each country to figure out a way for one nation to dominate the other Korean nation. So North and South Korea couldn't agree on anything to unify Korea as one. So in 1947, the US President Harry S. Truman persuaded the United Nations to have responsibility over South Korea, and Kim Jong-un strengthened control over Communist Party. So the North launched 10 cross-border guerrilla actions in order to draw the ROKA, which is the Republic of Korea Army units, away from guerrilla suppression campaign in the South. Sangman-Rhee, on campaign in the South, he became the president of South Korea, and Kim Jong-un is the president of North Korea. So 8,000 members of the South Korean security force and roughly 30,000 other Koreans were killed. So the China interfered eventually. So mid-September, General MacArthur landed 2 divisions, which is 155 miles in enemy territory, at port of Incheon. So North Koreans broke and fled back north. So MacArthur led his soldiers across the 38th parallel and deep into North Korea. So the US Air Force got north out of the sky. No one knows how many people died in this war. 40,000 servicemen died roughly. For the British casualties, there were about 1,078 killed, 2,674 wounded, and roughly 1,060 missing or imprisoned. Roughly 46,000 South Korean soldiers were killed and over 100,000 wounded. Chinese lost the biggest casualties though. So China lost 400,000. So 400,000 men died and 486,000 were wounded, and 21,000 were captured or imprisoned. North Koreans lost 215,000, 303,000 were wounded, and over 101,000 were captured. The war ended in 1953, but sadly the country is still divided.